On a normal bass fishing day, you'd start early in the morning. That's when the bass are up in the shallows, in the shoals, close to shore, just like this. In fact, this is ideal looking structure. You can see some trees falling off in the water here, some dead ones that are laying over. There's some stumps. Bass like to lurk around these stumps, and at this time of year, it's when they're spawning. They're in from 2 to 4 feet of water. And largemouth bass, if you look at one on somebody's stringer sometime, if you haven't caught one, they have a large mouth. The reason they have that big mouth is that they're predators. They're after other fish. They're after crawdads, after worms. They even take baby ducks, anything almost that is small enough that comes close to the surface of the water, they'll jump up and grab. So one way of catching these, especially in the early morning when they're in the shallow water, is with surface baits. Now, if you look in your tackle box, you might have some that look something like this. This is a classic lure here, the jitterbug, arbogast jitterbug. Has a big lip on it that gurgles in the water as you pull it through. Hula popper, same type of thing, a rubber skirt on it. That might simulate the legs of a frog trailing out behind. There's other lures here. This is a Burke a pop top, and here's one that's called a top dog, but these are made out of plastic type of material, rubber type, that flexes and bends, and it also has weedless. Now, this lure right here is not weedless. See the treble hooks dangling below the lure? Well, those could conceivably catch on sticks, logs, and so on. If you're not a real accurate caster, you might want to consider a lure like this. Here's called a Bessassin. It's the same arbogast jitterbug type, made out of flexible plastic, but it has a weedless guard on it right there. So you can pull it over sticks and stumps and it won't engage in the hook. But the idea is if a bass hits it and squeezes, he pushes that weedless up and he'll catch that right in his mouth. Good idea with your lures is to test them in the water for the action. Now this one, for example, it floats. All of these lures with lips on them float. And of course there's some like a crankbait that goes deep. But these flat lips like this, they're designed to gurgle. You see how it's making bubbles there in the water? Now you can retrieve it in jerks like this or in a steady retrieve. I'll show you how I do it. Fishing in the morning, looking up here in those logs. Bass a lot of times like to hang underneath the logs in the shadows, around structure. They can hide behind things and ambush little fish as they're coming through. So I'd cast it as close as I can to that stump. Now that's about an ideal cast. I'd let it set right there. Maybe sometimes up to 30 seconds. It all depends because the bass can hear it splash and he might move in real slow, move in on it. And he'll tend to hit it when you start moving the lure like this. So I like to retrieve in short jerks. Same way I like to retrieve daredevils or silver minnows. I just feel that a bass or any fish will tend to hit when he sees an erratic motion. But you can retrieve it slowly. Now you see the bubbles it makes right here as I'm pulling it and a gurgling? That's the way, different ways you can fish a surface bait. The color, well, a lot of people ask me about color, and I know there's a lot of you fishermen out there are going to say it makes a lot of difference. Okay. I use what I have in my tackle box. I think a lot of these surface lures are silhouetted against the sky. I don't care what color the lure is, it's going to be silhouetted in the morning or the evening or during the day. What do you think, Ed?
Well, I think below the water, color is the most important thing. But above the water, noise. And how about this? A buzz bait. We've got some propellers up here that gurgle right along the water. Below, a nice big hook for a big bass. Come in all sorts of sizes. Here's a little smaller one with like a wing almost on the front. Here's one with a larger wing, and it also on the end has a spoon.
Now that spoon would probably ride, these ride along the top of the water.
That's right, exactly, not below the water, even though they kind of do look like spinnerbaits, I guess. Here's one of my favorites, a triple wing. Favorite because it rides on top of the water at a slow retrieve. Let me throw it in the water here and give you a little demonstration. Again, the wing on top is making a gurgling sound, and I've got a hook that's just below the water. I think a bait like this is good for some real big fish.
Oh yeah, well it's good. I like them in the rain.
In the rain? Oh yeah.
In the rain because they do make noise under the surface and there's a lot of commotion up there. Go ahead, cast it out there. Show
and late at night I think these are just real productive lures. Again, I'm retrieving it so it's on top of the water. It's making a gurgling sound. The bass hear it and see it.
A slow, steady retrieve. With a buzz bait like that, you have to keep it moving. You can't let it stop, it'll sink and lose its pizzazz. And of course, here's a lure that is an under-the-water type of spinner. It's a blade, a single blade that spins around the shaft. On the end is a treble hook. There's a lot of styles and sizes that they come in. Here's a rather large one, an old Buell spinner. The large hook. Now this would not be too large for largemouth bass.
Not at
As
all.
I said, they have big mouths and they'll grab onto lures. Sometimes the smaller ones, they'll hit on something as large as they are because they're mighty hungry, voracious feeders in the spring. Now the way you fish something like this is you're going to cast it out and you're going to let it sink. Now that's the nice thing about the spinners like this. It can allow you to get down to the bottom. It'll sink quickly, but that's the action. And you can retrieve it in jerks like this, or you can do a slow, steady retrieve. But that's how the spinner works. And of course, a spinner bait's another popular one, Ed.
Well, not only popular, Fred, but definitely one of my favorites. Here's one, it's white. Here's the big hook on the back, and a couple of spinners on top that kind of shine and shimmer through the water. I want to put this in the water.
Yeah, now that's called a safety pin lure. Hold that up there so
exactly.
they can see. It's weedless.
Yeah.
You can bump the bottom with that,
Yep.
and you won't catch the weeds.
That's right. Let me throw this thing in the water. This is real good for shallow water with a lot of weeds in it. See those spinners go?
And the skirt shimmers and dances.
Now, if I drop this to the bottom, I can bounce it along the bottom.
And pick it up without catching any weeds.
Mm-hmm.
Now here's a bait I'm going to set next to yours, Ed. It looks like a surface bait, but it isn't. It's called a crankbait. If we look at it, it has a plastic lip on it, which is clear. And actually, you don't see that in the water. And it's a minnow imitating lure, like the Finnish minnow, the Rapala. But watch what happens when I pull it. It digs down, that lip digs it down underneath the water. Now, this is good for open water fishing, but I'm going to cast it right over there by those sticks. And there's one problem with it. I don't know if I'm going to pull anything up here. But as it digs down underneath the water, look at that. I came up with some weeds. Now, weeds do not help the action of your lure. And this crankbait is a good bait, but you have to be out in more open water or else they'll pick up the weeds. So I'm going to change it. If I'm fishing in water where there are submerged weeds, it's a good place to fish, by the way, because that's where the fish lurk. That's where the bait fish are. I'm going to take something that is weedless. You recognize this? This is an old Johnson spoon, vintage model out of my tackle box. Johnson Silver Minnow, invented by Lewis Johnson years ago. There's a number of different types of spoons of this nature with skirts, like this, a rubber skirt. But here's a old traditional bait that was used a long time ago. I'm going to put this on this is a bass double, and it has a weed guard on it to keep it from catching on the weeds. I'll clip this to my lure, but what I'm going to add, instead of a rubber skirt, this was the origination of rubber skirts right here. This is a piece of pork rind. Came right off a pig, Ed. Pig hide is what it is, and it's tough, has a little hole in it, and you take that hole, you put it right through the hook. There, it snaps over the barb on the hook. Now watch the action. The trick to casting a Johnson Silver Minnow, a bass double, something like this with pork rind, is a slow, steady retrieve. You see the way it just dances back and forth in the water? It rocks with a slow retrieve. That's what you want to do. But I can let this sink right to the bottom and pull it. I can jerk it, and I can even work it like a jig, and it's very effective.
Speaking of jigs, I'll tell you, if those bass are feeding on the bottom, there's not much better lure that you can use. Here's one. You probably have in your tackle box, a little lead head on the front, a hook, a lively little rubber skirtish tail on the back.
Well, it's a Mr. Twister type.
Yeah, a lot of life there. Now here's one that I have had a lot of luck with, a lot bigger. You know, I'm kind of one of those guys that believes in a bigger lure for big fish, if you want to catch those big ones.
Well, there is truth to that.
Yeah, how to use one in the water? Well, I don't think there's a bad way to use a jig. You kind of just want to bounce it off the bottom.
But it's definitely for the bottom.
Yeah, give it some life there. Or you can even pull it right along. I've had luck using it that way too.
Okay, here's one that I'm going to toss in next to yours. See this one?
Yay.
This little white one here? That's called a pinky jig. And I know it doesn't look like much, and it's small. And I don't know what you would think it imitates. I think that the bass, who may not have the color perception maybe that we do, would think it's a little minnow or an insect, a nymph feeding along the bottom. But this is how you fish it. You let it set on the bottom, and now the hook faces upwards on a jig. That's why you don't get caught all the time. But up and down like that. And that is a little pinky jig. Now with this is a light lure, maybe a 1/4 ounce. I'm using light line, 4-pound test, and a light rod. This is a spinning rod. I don't really recommend the light rods for bass because with a light line and the light tackle, you have a limber rod. And you see when you go to set the hook, whoops, like I did right on my pants right there. When you go to set the hook, the rod springs.
Yeah.
And you don't get the bite into the fish that you do, say, with a casting rod. This is what I prefer for casting accuracy, and it's a good stiff rod. Mm-hmm. Boy, you set the hook on it and you can get it through the bony mouths of a bass. You know, speaking of the jigs, here's something that I don't want to neglect. It's popular down south, an imitation rubber worm. And you see these in the store just by the hundreds, by the thousands, and they're real big down south in the reservoirs. And this is the way you rig them. You could use a hook even bigger than this, called a Texas-style rigging. You rig it right through the nose of the rubber worm, and you bring it out, okay? You're not ready yet. You don't fish with them like this, folks. If you do, you're going to get snagged on the bottom. It's not necessarily going to ride with the hook up. So in Texas, what they do is they bury the hook into the worm, but not so the barb or the point even protrudes. That way you can throw it out with a little sinker ahead of it, pull it through the weeds, and when a fish hits and grabs it, pow, there it is. The barb is ready to hook right. Now, one thing I got to mention with hooks, sharpen your hooks. Use sharp hooks with largemouth bass and really lace it to them. Here is a typical, it's like an artificial crawler harness. It has 3 hooks in series. No matter where the bass strikes, if he hits towards the front of the worm or towards the back, he's going to be hooked. And these are very effective. Where are Bob and Ann? Are they right over here? Mm-hmm. Well, they're trolling right towards us right now. But they've been trolling back and forth with a little electric motor on the back of that boat. There's Bob Garner in the front, Ann Knope and Bob Knope. They're from Dearborn in the back, and they've been trolling using these rubber worms. And earlier today, Ed, we sat here with the cameras rolling.
They did quite well. In fact, our surface baits did not produce nearly as well as the baits that went low in the water, like trolling that rubber worm behind the electric motor. The key to their success, Annie just boated a pike there earlier in the morning when it was windier. Bob Knope and Bob Garner, they pulled in about 30 bass, and they had a number of legal bass there. In fact, by the end of the day, they had quite a stringer. But the thing was, it was very unusual. Bob Knope says on this lake, this private lake, he has fished many times before. Never has he had to fish so deep and so slowly as he did on this particular Tuesday. There was a stringer of bass that they took along with Ann Knope's pike. They did quite well, as you can see. A lot of anglers would be happy with that. There are 3 limits of largemouth bass right there. All of them above legal size dandies.